current and increasing creativity is therefore needed for success. Next, we require to get into shift to a virtual environment, which we have done in many ways for many institutions, organizations. Research indicates that learning resources should be customizable, human-centric in their functionality, and accessible anywhere from home, from the classroom, and the battleship. High-performing organizations have implemented an approach to worker development that considers the dynamic nature of jobs and the equally dynamic potential of people to reinvent themselves. Experience shows that organizations that focus on building workers' resilience for the short and long term also increase their resilience in the face of constant change. The gig economy, the observation we have made in recent months is that the uncertainty surrounding the pandemic, coronavirus pandemic, is actually driving many of our clients towards a contingent project-based hiring model. This is a result of many layoffs, as you know, salary cuts experienced in many organizations, especially during the months of April, May, and June 2020. Organizations faced with the need to hire labor are therefore beginning to embrace a contingent workforce model with a strategic focus on projects rather than positions. A shift from complicated to complex. HR leaders will need to cultivate more improved and quality partnerships, therefore, with employees. And in this case, the focus should be on employee and engagement based on interpersonal relationships rather than control, standards, and the hierarchy. Adopting a complexity mindset begins with accepting that complexity exists and it needs to be accounted for differently. And in this context, leaders can embrace this mindset and tap into the power of collective intelligence. A majority of workforce consists of smart and trustworthy people who know their jobs better than perhaps the leaders do. It is imperative, therefore, that the leaders get closer to their workforce. Skills of the future, determinants and drivers of the future. In that connection, we are saying that the skills of the future would be those that respond to the following: dynamics of the talent landscape, rapidly changing business models, and a shift to create space for who, where, when, and how work is done. The critical drivers shall entail incorporation, analysis, and focus on the impacts of technology, globalization, governance, and social values. Beyond skills, beyond the skills. Organizations need to look beyond skilling to investing in resilience for the uncertain futures. It is important to note that reskilling alone may be a strategic dead end, which we must strive to avoid. What is needed is a worker development approach that considers both the dynamic nature of jobs and the equally proactive and dynamic potential of people to reinvent themselves. To do this effectively, organizations should therefore focus on building the workers' resilience from both the short and long term, a focus that allows organizations to increase their own resilience in the face of constant change and uncertainty. Growth of the remote office. The traditional working hours from 8 to 5 are paving way for flexible working hour schedules, so that it doesn't have to always be from 8 to 5, because you can work from different stations. This trend is not just limited to developed countries, but is also catching up with developing countries. This shift has been accelerated by availability of digital tools and make it possible to communicate and manage projects and track performance. In fact, one of the top concerns of employment seekers today, employment seekers of the future, shall be as to whether or not they will have the option of working remotely before they could even consider being interviewed by potential employers. This goes to show that the flexible work hours and work arrangements are gaining popularity in an already candidate-driven market. The future. For the employer of the future, the work environment is therefore increasingly becoming more legalistic than previously witnessed. We are saying here that the legal dimensions and the tendency to fall back on legal options is increasing, so that the employer of the future must take this into account, this tendency to become more legalistic than hitherto experienced. Therefore, in guiding the workforce, the regulatory environment is progressively shifting towards what is referred to as social contract between the employee and the organization. This is
I'd just like to cue you.
Professor. Thank you. Yes, this is especially more so now that the workers are beginning to operate from home. As they work from home, the employees are required to make decisions and develop values that are positively attendant to engagement and application of their skills in compliance with the contract between them and their employers. For the employers, I'm moving quickly to finish, and in order to ensure commitment of the workers to seamlessly serve the organization, it will be critically imperative to tap into laws that facilitate viable, workable, and sustainable employee-employer partnership that are well adapted to the need and commitment to cope with the changing work environment as well as competing technological applications. Organizations should therefore consider an approach that treats the workforce development as a strategy for building workers and organizational resilience, equipping workers and organization with the tools and strategies to adapt to a range of uncertain futures, in addition to reskilling them for the near-term needs. Through a resilience lens, reinvention therefore shifts from something that may threaten the worker security to the very thing that defines the worker security. Workers who are constantly renew their skills and learn new skills are most likely to find employment in today's rapidly shifting job market.
We capture some of the key highlights you're referring to, which is workers need to constantly renew their skills. So they need to upskill and reskill. Workers need to be more resilient and it is those that update their skill set that will thrive in this uncertain times. The shift from the complicated to the complex was also explored, where leaders are being asked to get closer to their workforce, to humanize the experience.
Muted. We cannot hear.
Thank you.
That. We've received a good conversation there from Professor Enos Njeru, where he captures the need for the shift from the complicated to the complex. And he is asking employers to move closer to their employees. And it is these employees that need to be resilient in these times of uncertainty in order to ensure that they remain in the workforce, and that they need to upskill and reskill in order to be relevant in the current times. I want to move on to the panel. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce three panelists that will take us through exploring the two earlier speakers and their conversations around how the employer and the employee need to navigate this uncertain times. Professor Nzunzi Ndwaba.
You will see that from a socio-economic point of view of issues facing Africa, the COVID has exacerbated what we refer to as pre-existing conditions, because by no means are these new issues. These are issues that have been there for a very long time, that have been ignored, that have been under the surface. And so now issues of low economic growth, low productivity, informality, unemployment, particularly with the youth, child and forced labor, governance gaps, gender gaps, poverty, low social protection coverage, and an unsustainable rural-urban migration are the issues that were pre-existing all along. If you can go to the next slide for me, you will see that in 2019, the ILO at its centenary celebration came up with a centenary declaration on the future of work. For the first time in the history of the ILO, there was a mention of productivity, not once, not twice, but 11 times, which was a huge achievement for employers, because previously there had never been in an instrument of the ILO an official mention of productivity, as important as we may feel it is as employers. The important role of sustainable enterprises as generators of employment and promoters of innovation was also enhanced. I think I might just also mention that there was a particular line in the declaration that says the private sector is recognized as the principal role player in the creation of employment, in the creation of productive employment. The enabling environment for entrepreneurship and sustainable enterprises was also highlighted. Diverse forms of work arrangement were also highlighted. And when you go to the next slide, you will see that as early as 2018, when we had the ILO Panama meetings at which there was a declaration, and then in 2019 last year, after the ILO Centenary Declaration, we had another declaration for Africa in Abidjan in Cote d'Ivoire, where we confirmed all these guiding principles that would be necessary to unleash potential for growth and prosperity. And really this is what this is about, is how do we unleash potential for growth and prosperity? The next slide. If you look at the future of work, there are 5 mega trends that have been identified by all the major collectors or collators of surveys. Technological advances, as I was listening to the professor who was speaking before me, mention this, changing demographics, climate change, globalization, and the 5th mega trend that we picked up as the International Labour Organization and the International Organization of Employers on changing business and opportunities for employer organizations was shortage of skilled labor. Now, I have to pause just for 1 second and make sure that we're all on the same page. So when I mention the International Labour Organization, I take it that everybody that is watching and listening knows who I'm talking about. But just in case I've missed the boat, I need to say that it is the mother of work or the father of work, irrespective of which gender you prefer. So anything you can think about in the world of work, whether it's occupational safety and health, whether it's child labor, whether it's Freedom of Association Convention 87, or whether it's Collective Bargaining Convention 98, or whatever it is, comes from the ILO as interpreted by our laws on the ground. The ILO has 187 member states, and I, representing the employers of the IOE, we have 159 members in 150 countries and representing just over 50 million companies. So when I say these 5 mega trends have been identified, we've made use of the over 50 million companies that we represent as the IOE and operating within the ILO. How are these future of work megatrends changing the landscape of the private sector is really the question we must also answer for us to come up with solutions. When you go to the next slide, you will see that the impact of the megatrends in the world of work changes the way we organize our work in terms of working time, in terms of location, monitoring systems, the employment status of workers. The definition of an employer is very different today. The evolution of skills needed by the industry, skills gaps, shortages, mismatches, the quality of jobs and working conditions, issues of wages, issues of job security, employment rates, if automation will displace jobs, workers of the gig economy, fears that we've had to deal with. And when you move to the next slide, you'll see that the dynamics of the industrial relations and social dialogue between employers and workers are also changing hugely. Pressures on existing social protection systems, education, and healthcare systems, how policymakers address issues linked to poverty, human rights, migration, informality, the gender pay gap, perceived inequalities, and the digital divide. Informality during the pandemic has been exposed as one of the biggest areas we need to pay attention to, because quite frankly, the territories that we come from, Africa, Latin America, of the developing nations, they need by far to get attention from us through innovation and creativity for us to be able to have social protection that covers everybody. Issues of rules and regulations to govern all of the above in terms of how the ILO proceeds with the standard setting agenda needs to be revisited. When you look at figures and trends, the global employment rate in 2000 at 6.4% and in 2018 at 5% in terms of the data that we get from the ILO. The global youth unemployment rate in 2016 was 13.1%. 71 million youths around the world without a job, which has been completely exacerbated now by the COVID. Globally, 61% of all workers engaged in informal employment. Those numbers as well are numbers we must look at, which now because of the COVID has also been exacerbated. The global gender pay gap stood at 23% pre the COVID, and now post-COVID that we are quite certain is going to get a lot worse. When you look at the future of work policy recommendation for governments in the G20, in the G7, in the ILO, in the World Bank, in the OECD, you will see that all of this says we need to change the way we do business. We need to do things differently. We need to act boldly. We live in very unprecedented times that need unprecedented action. We need to be able to dig deep and do those things we are very uncomfortable with. And when you go to the next slide, you will see that the concerns that business leaders have about the future of work are mirrored in that slide, which I'm not going to go into because of time, but I ask that you please look at that slide very closely to see why we have the concerns we have, because the speed of disruption is accelerating at a much enhanced rate. And when you look at the next slide, the changing business and opportunities for employers and business organizations, we talked about how technological advances as one of the mega trends is seen as the biggest disruptor of all mega trends. The challenge of locating and hiring, as I've mentioned. And when you go to the next slide, you'll see that it continues also. We highlight the same points that I raised earlier about the issues of skills for the world of work, which is creating huge problems at entry-level positions. And how do we then manage the transition is the question. How do we move forward? And when you look at the next slide, you'll see that all the findings show very high levels of concern throughout the world. Whether you're in the developed world, in the US, which is sitting at 61%, Brazil at 70%, India at 66%, Germany at 65%, and so on and so on. And when you move on again, next slide, I'm really going through these slides at a very fast pace. You can skip that one as well and go to the USCIB slide. You will see that there are challenges that we are operating on, trying to see how we can create agency and emergency in the world of work through the employer organizations that we represent, who are our members. And we go to the next slide, you'll also see that understanding the trends, impacts on the skilling of the workforce and how talent acquisition processes evolve. And I will ask you to please move to me to slide number 19, where I make 10 recommendations that we need to be aware of for small and large companies to harness future of work opportunities. Creating a conducive, open, and attractive ICT culture is absolutely critical. Shifting the mindset to create an ICT culture that promotes innovative, responsive, and meaningful consumer and employee connections is absolutely pivotal. The second one on the second slide is determining how to balance humans with machines. And this is absolutely critical because everybody talks about machines. And I can tell you, I'm not one of the negative people about what machines will do to us. But what we need to be aware of is that for the machines not to create a challenge, we need to be consciously aware at all times that human capital development must be able to manage the transition, make sure that our people are skilled, reskilled, upskilled, so that at all times you are able to balance the human interaction with that of the machines. The next slide talks about treating workers as customers is absolutely critical. Engage your employees in the transition rather than just informing them that change is coming. The fourth slide, the next slide, is understanding that taking small steps at a time is better than none. The future of work is not just a human resources issue. You need to build centers of excellence. It is an issue that is for all of us, not just human resources. The next slide, understanding the importance of attracting a diverse workforce, finding ways to cultivate loyal and engaged employees. Do you change your people or change the way your people work? These are the questions we need to be aware of. Next slide. When you look at point number 7 is understanding that the workforce is more agile than what employers generally think. 3 out of 4 workers understand the need to prepare for the future of work. 2 out of 3 expressed confidence in their ability to prepare for the change that we are dealing with. The next slide says, don't just set up training programs, create a learning culture. It's very, very important. In this 1 minute that I have left, if you get nothing else, remember this: you've got to learn. You've got to find ways to unlearn the old habits that we've learned, because unless we do that, unless we have attitudinal change, unless we change the way we behave, unless we change the issues in terms of gender, we change the issues in terms of looking at the youth, in terms of embracing how we need youthful exuberance and youthful ideas, we're not going to be able to do this. The next slide talks about being open to adopt environmentally sustainable processes. According to Al Gore, there can be no healthy people without a healthy planet. The next slide says the importance of regular engagement with national employer organizations is absolutely critical. And when I talk about employer organizations, I talk like organizations like the FKE. The FKE that is hosting this conference today, you need to do that and not reinvent the wheel.
Thank you, Professor Ndwaba. We really appreciate that. You brought on a really strong agenda around learn to learn, and that if organizations and enterprises are not exuberant about their youth, are not exuberant about the gender issues, are not exuberant around the persons with disabilities too, then we will find that those do not thrive. They will possibly survive, but they will not thrive. The speed of disruption, you touched on that, and the need again to interface with technology, and that organizations and enterprises need to focus on an ICT culture. It used to be something we were afraid of, but it is something now we must embrace. How to balance humans and machines, that is a key focus going forward, and also how to engage employees during this period of transition. Don't talk to them, talk with them. That is coming out very strongly. And lastly, I want to thank you very much, Professor. You went through that brilliantly, and we will be sharing these slides with our members so that they are up to speed on the way forward, on your thoughts, and the thoughts of all the other speakers. Delegates, I want to remind you that the hashtag is Employee Conference 2020. And with that, Professor, I will allow you to step out should you wish to. But of course, we will hope to have you again in future sessions. Allow me now to introduce 2 members of the panel. Mr. Wellington Chibebe, who is the ILO Country Office Director in charge of the following 5 countries: Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi. He is also a former Zimbabwe trade union leader and also an international trade union leader, and is an award-winning human rights defender. He has previously held the position of a Deputy Secretary General of the International Trade Union Confederation. Welcome, Mr. Wellington Chibebe. You will be accompanied on this panel with Mr. John Mwendwa. Mr. John Mwendwa is the Human Resources Director at the Coca-Cola Beverages Africa Group, and he is in charge of the HR functions at the Nairobi Bottlers in Kenya, the Equator Bottlers, and the Crown Beverages. He has a vast experience in HR management across an extensive cross-industry exposure, ranging from aviation to banking to telecom and to the fast-moving consumer goods sector. He holds an MBA in strategic management from the USIU University and a manager's development certification from an institution in India, the India Institute of Management. Welcome both of you to the forum. I would like to begin with Mr. Chibebe.
Mr. Chibebe,
we've heard a lot of the nuances, which is how do we interface technology with humanity? How do we humanize the experience that our employees are going through, given that they're not able to physically interact? Most of their time is offline, is digital. And also, how do we interface with a lot of the educated, exposed, qualified workforce who are now out of the workforce? Specific to you, Mr. Chibebe, what is the ILO doing to help enterprises in Africa leverage on the changing human capital trends and skills of the future? Welcome, sir.
As was said by Professor Mdwaba, the declaration of the ILO was looking into the future. And it was only in June of 2019 that the ILO Centenary Declaration for the Future of Work was actually made. 6 months down the line, in June, we actually were able to see the future that was being predicted. But in the declaration for the future of work, one of the cornerstones of the declaration was the issue of skills and the human capital trends and looking into the future. And this declaration was also replicated in the Abidjan Declaration of December 2019, with skills forming one of the cornerstones of the African programs. And in terms of the declaration, it was actually clear to say that the approach was to promoting skills acquisition and competencies and qualifications for all workers through their working lives and throughout their working lives as a joint responsibility of governments and social partners in order to address existing and anticipated skills gap. I would want to underline the anticipated skills gap. Also, pay particular attention to ensuring that education and training systems are responsive to labor market needs, taking into account the evolution of work, which means work is not static. We have to look into the future and also to consider where we are coming from, where we are, and where we would want to go as nations. Also to enhance workers' capacity to make use of opportunities available for decent work. That is in terms of human capital development.